Okay, so just to keep things straight, we're still looking at step 3 of the research cycle, selecting a research method. And the second kind of research method we're going to look at is surveys. I think everybody knows what a survey is. Everybody has participated in a survey of one kind or another. They are widely used in all social sciences, not just sociology. What does a survey generally do? It asks people about their attitudes, their knowledge, their behaviors. And because they can be utilized to seek such general knowledge, they fit well with the social sciences. Surveys present a set of questions to a subject who will then provide responses, or data to a researcher either in person, on the phone, and in these days we also have the internet. Now, when conducting a survey, it's important that you use a sample, and all this means is part of the group that you want to study, part of the population that you're interested in analyzing. Conversely, if a sample is just a part of it, a population would be the entire group, not the little piece of pie, but the whole pie. A population is the entire group the researcher will eventually make generalizations about. Why is only a sample used instead of an entire population? For very, very practical reasons. Mainly because of time and cost. Imagine the time involved in surveying an entire city, an entire community. The time involved in preparing surveys to be distributed, or calling everyone, or face-to-face interviews. No matter what structure the survey took, it is simply too many people to deal with in an efficient manner. Imagine the time involved in processing all of the surveys, in comparing answers, in analyzing them. And in real research, this would also greatly increase cost. It would be an inefficient use of whatever budget the researcher has, as well as an inefficient use of people conducting the research, of human resources. So a sample lets you generalize the results to the entire population that sample is taken from, the entire population that sample represents. But this is also why the manner in which it is chosen is extremely important. Because if a sample is not chosen properly, the results of the research will be invalid. When you choose a sample, it is extremely important to choose participants randomly, which means that of the whole population, the target population, everybody has the exact same chance of being chosen to be part of the sample, and the same chance of being excluded. Only if this is done properly can you then generalize the results to represent an entire population. So I'll give you an example. I live in North Bay, where the university is located, and let's imagine for a moment that I want you to conduct research regarding opinions of road maintenance throughout the year. Whether citizens of North Bay feel the roads in this city are generally in good shape or not, and repaired in a timely manner when needed. So to conduct this research, let's say North Bay is about 50,000 people, and I choose to survey 3,000 people out of the 50,000. And because I live in the West Ferris area, I'm just going to sample people from this area because this is where I myself live. Well, this is a problem. I can't generalize any results to represent all of North Bay as a whole, because the sample wouldn't be chosen from all of North Bay as a whole. Maybe they were chosen randomly from one area, but they were not from one area. But they were all from one area, not the whole city. Different parts of North Bay were generally built at one time. In the West Ferris area, this part of North Bay was, for the most part, really built up in the 60s and 70s. Downtown was built earlier than that, which also means most of the roads in each area were constructed and paved during the same time. This is why, for a few years, it might seem like one area of town is benefiting from a lot of repaving, from a lot of sewer maintenance, because everything in an area was generally put in around the same time, and as a result, everything begins to kind of wear out around the same time. So if I only focus on one part of North Bay's population, the West Ferris area, I wouldn't be able to generalize my results to the entire city. This is why the manner in which a sample is chosen is important. It must be chosen randomly to represent the people I say that it represents. As I said, if you're making use of a survey, this can be done in several ways. It might be mailed to potential respondents. They complete it, then mail it back. It could also be emailed. It could be a survey on a website. It could be completed in person somewhere. So there are various methods of getting the survey to respondents and getting the information back. Another method of collecting information from a survey that sociologists can often use is the face-to-face interview, where you actually ask somebody the questions directly. And usually you have some training in this. You have to be trained to conduct interviews. This might be more effective or less effective depending on the purpose of the research. Sometimes a face-to-face interview or an interview by phone is the best way to obtain really complete answers and the most information, because you ask a question and then you can ask more and more and more. But if the research is focused on a sensitive topic or a personal topic, that can backfire. So the researcher needs to really consider the situation as a whole and put themselves in the place of potential respondents. No matter what format is chosen, a survey necessitates creating a questionnaire of some kind, and they contain two types of questions: closed-ended and open-ended. And this might seem simple in terms of how they're defined, but it's not always quite as simple in choosing when to use them. Closed-ended, you have a list of answers to choose from, so they are structured questions. Closed-ended questions are sometimes called fixed response questions. Then you have open-ended questions, so there isn't a list of answers to choose from. You have lines to write your answer on. There are benefits and disadvantages of both styles. Closed-ended questions. These are absolutely the right choice in some situations because they usually take much less time to answer, so the researcher can obtain a lot of information quickly. And to put this in academic terms, closed-ended questions make data collection much quicker. They're beneficial if somebody is not quite as literate or articulate, so they're not at a disadvantage with this kind of question. Closed-ended questions, like I said, usually take less time to process, less time to analyze, because responses for each question are given a numerical code, and you can input these easily into a spreadsheet for analysis. As a result of this, it can be easier for the researcher to compare the responses of different respondents, because you're comparing predetermined answers that don't have room for great variation. You're not comparing apples and oranges. Closed-ended questions, however, are not the best choice for every survey or for every survey topic, because they can have a negative effect. They can end up forcing respondents to give simplistic responses to more complex issues because there's no room for elaboration. You just fill in the bubble or you check the box and that's it. Furthermore, closed-ended questions can be quite leading because they suggest ideas that the respondent might not have thought of on their own. So with the basic format of a closed-ended question with preformed responses, the preformed responses end up influencing the response. So some people feel they're not entirely valid. In other words, they can kind of bias people into giving a certain kind of response because they have a list of suggested answers right in front of them. Sometimes respondents can become frustrated with closed-ended questions because the answer that they want is not one of the choices offered. And I think all of us have had this happen. The answer that best suits me doesn't fit any of the little boxes. So I have to kind of choose the one that is closest to my response, even if it's not 100% accurate. And some people can become frustrated or confused if there's too many responses offered. So you're creating the questionnaire and you're thinking, I'm going to put every possible response I can think of, which sounds great, but sometimes it's almost too much of a good thing. And even something as simple as human error with closed-ended questions. Something as simple as a clerical error. Maybe the respondent accidentally checks the wrong box, or the researcher accidentally enters the wrong answer when entering information on the computer, and that can be a problem. So don't misunderstand me. Closed-ended questions are valuable, and they absolutely have a solid place in questionnaires for survey research. However, what they also do is kind of stop the conversation, because answers are very limited and you simply don't have room for a more detailed answer. Open-ended questions are the opposite, and they also have negatives and positives. I think obviously on the positive side, the most important benefit of an open-ended question is that they allow researchers to gain a lot of detailed insight into a respondent's thoughts, their attitudes, their ideas about the subject at hand, because the response is open-ended. They can write whatever they want, and they can usually write or respond as much as they want. They can provide the answer they want to provide. So a respondent with an open-ended question may give you an answer that you never, ever would have thought of. You never would have considered it. They might voice concerns or attitudes or perspectives the researcher never would have considered on their own. And with a closed-ended question, that information never ever would have been provided. So open-ended questions generally provide much richer, deeper information, no matter what the topic is, and there is no researcher bias with the responses because no responses have been suggested. However, there's got to be a however. There are also disadvantages to using open-ended questions. The biggest of which is open-ended questions can be incredibly time-consuming to administer and complete, and incredibly difficult to analyze because the data they provide is not neat, orderly responses from a list. So an answer to a closed-ended question is exact. There's no variation, which makes it easier to understand, easier to interpret, to summarize, to analyze. You can code it quite easily. With an open-ended question, you cannot code open-ended answers. I mean, you can, but you can't. It's just much more difficult. And in addition, with an open-ended question, someone who is not very literate might struggle with them because a certain level of reading and writing is required. Now, no matter which style of question you use, of course, if you're developing a questionnaire, you want to do everything you can to make certain you're asking the questions in a neutral way, that you're not leading the respondent towards a particular answer. Let's look at this example. Do you consider adequate funding of overcrowded emergency rooms to be an important issue, yes or no? I have got a huge problem with this question because of the wording. Do you consider adequate funding? Well, right there, who's going to say no, emergency rooms should not have adequate funding? Adequate seems to suggest basic. So who's going to say no, emergency rooms should not have basic funding? And then overcrowded emergency rooms. Overcrowded is a loaded term or phrase because you automatically have this picture pop in your head. So again, it seems straightforward and simple, but it's not unusual when you're looking at a questionnaire that you'll often find the way questions are worded reflects an underlying opinion that the researcher has that they're trying to draw out. This is what I would call a loaded question. It's trying to get a specific answer from you. Here are other biased questions. Do you prefer greasy meat or healthy vegetables on your pizza? Well, greasy meat is a negative description. Healthy vegetables is a positive description. Do you think that soothing classical music is more pleasing than the loud, obnoxious pop music that teenagers listen to? So, of course, these are extreme examples, right? But I mean, they're obvious like this to prove a point. And you might think that it's easy to design an effective questionnaire. You might think that it's simple. You know what kind of information you're looking for, and you're going to ask some questions, and that's it. But it can be difficult, and you have to take certain things into consideration. So the textbook makes 4 points regarding surveys that should always be kept in mind. Again, because there's no point in doing this if your results are not going to be valid or true. The first thing is you want to make sure you don't exclude part of the population from the sampling frame, like I said. This is exactly what I was talking about with the example of road maintenance. You can't choose a sample in the manner I described and then generalize those results to an entire population. If you're going to generalize the results to a specific population, then you need to make sure you select the sample randomly. It's a fact of life that some people are going to refuse to participate in the survey. How often do you get a phone call at home and you just say, sorry, I don't have the time? Or somebody approaches you at the mall to ask you if you have a few minutes to answer some questions and you say no. So for a researcher, this can be frustrating, but it happens and you have to expect it. Just because you ask someone for information doesn't mean they have to give it to you. The textbook makes the point that some respondents are simply not going to answer questions frankly. This is also a danger when asking people about something, usually something sensitive, but it could also be that you look at the question and you just see a question. But they do, and they see something they are not sure they want to be completely honest about with you, and that's fine. So for example, if I tell this person I'm not completely satisfied with my experience at this hospital, it might eventually in some way make it back to the department I bring my child to, and I don't want to offend anyone in case it affects our services. If I tell somebody what my personal thoughts are, it might have consequences for me down the road. When you're creating a survey, as I said, you want to make sure not to ask confusing questions or leading questions or inflammatory questions. And I think I've already touched on this. Asking somebody if they consider adequate funding of emergency rooms to be an important issue, that's a leading question. It's a biased question with only one reasonable possible answer. It's a leading question. But in addition to this, as simple as it sounds, if a survey asks too many questions that are just irrelevant, like a lot of busy work, a respondent is not likely to finish the survey. A whole bunch of questions are not necessary. They take up space and time, and it's going to have a negative impact on the respondent. People lead busy lives, and they don't want to be bothered with what they perceive to be a waste of their time. So every question in a survey needs to have a reason to be there. And if not, it shouldn't be there. So, this is surveys. We're looking at research methods. First were experiments, second were surveys, and third is field research. This is the third research method. Often, this is one of the two pictures that will pop into somebody's head when you talk to them about research. They automatically think of an experiment in a lab, or they think of somebody out there conducting research in real life, investigating things, whatever the things may be, and that is field research. Field research is the research method that refers to the systematic observation of people in their natural settings. Not an artificial setting that you've created like an experiment. This is people in their natural settings. So field research might involve observation, used very, very heavily in the social sciences, sociology, psychology, anthropology, because field research lets you study people without interfering with their behavior. And because you're not interfering with their behavior, they don't know they're being watched, this doesn't affect their behavior. So that's a negative of an experimental situation. That in an experiment situation, there's always the possibility, always the danger, that the experiment itself could affect the results. You've created a false situation, whether that false situation refers to the physical environment or the social environment. So when a researcher goes into the field, whether that field is a hospital or a school, outside a police station, a mall, wherever it may be, the researcher in a field study wants to use detached observation. And all this means is they are simply recording information. No interference at all, or at least not trying to interfere at all. This is detached observation. And I'm going to give you an example of this. I'm going to use Las Vegas for this example for a few reasons, because it's a city and an atmosphere that I think everybody is familiar with. So, Las Vegas is our example. Let's pretend for a minute that we're all going to Las Vegas to conduct field research regarding how and how often people initiate interaction with strangers when they are intoxicated. I've always thought Vegas would be a great place to do research because there's just so much going on. So we're going to look at what they do. Do they tap them on the arm or the shoulder? Do they walk up to them and just start talking to them? Do they try to get their attention in some way by staring at them or winking at them or smiling at them? As the researcher, before you even went there, keeping detached observation in mind, you would create some kind of behavioral scheme, like a behavioral categorization card. And you would use this when you're sitting there observing, not interfering at all, so that all you need to do is check things off, indicating different behaviors at different times, etc. So on this card, let's imagine there's a table listing how many drinks you observe a person consuming, maybe even the kind of drink, whether it's liquor or beer or wine, how often a new drink is ordered to give you an idea if they are intoxicated or not, and the different types of contact that I suggested. Male or female, age, how long they've been at the bar, anything you can think of that might be relevant. How long the interaction with the person they don't know lasts, and whether the contact leads to further interaction, like a conversation. So you would be observing what went on with no interference at all, simply recording what occurred, hopefully in a subtle manner that was not obvious. But even doing this, there may be problems arise if you're not subtle enough. This is called reactivity. And it is, I think, the biggest difficulty that arises in field research with people. The fact that when a person knows they're being observed, this tends to affect their behavior. Maybe they'll try to conceal certain things, or at least to alter their behavior to appear more favorable because they know they're being observed. Maybe knowing somebody is watching them will make them act more gregarious and more outgoing, make them act out more than they normally would. Whatever the effect is, knowing somebody's watching them alters their behavior. So there you are in Vegas, you're sitting at a bar, let's say at Bally's, and you have your phone out with the pre-constructed categorization tables on them, and you did this because you figured having, papers out on a bar would be too obvious. But you're still not as subtle and inconspicuous as you thought you would be, because some of the people begin to pick up on the fact that you're watching them and then doing something with your phone, and watching them and doing something with your phone over and over. This then alters their behavior. They begin to kind of rein in their behavior. They don't continue to act as freely as they were because they clue in that they're being observed, and this makes them uncomfortable. This is a big problem with field research, this idea of reactivity, and this has to be taken into account when looking at results. The tendency of people who are observed by a researcher to react to their presence by concealing certain things or acting artificially to impress them. This is the first big problem. The second is that the meaning of the observed behavior may remain obscure to the researcher. What this means is that when you watch someone and observe how they behave, you won't necessarily have an accurate or complete understanding of their behavior. Essentially, you may misinterpret it. The textbook gives the example of somebody winking. How do you, as the observer who is completely uninvolved, know what the meaning of that is? Maybe it absolutely is indeed a come on with a sexual nature. Maybe this person winks at everybody. It's just part of their normal communication patterns, and to them, it's no big deal. It's nothing unusual. But you, as the observer, simply don't know. You can guess, you can infer, you can imply, but when you come right down to it, you don't know. The meaning of the observed behavior remains obscure to the researcher.